everyone, and welcome to the first video in my Venturing into Vintage series. This series will be a little bit different than my normal sewing content, but not as different as some of the other videos that I've made recently. Instead of a series focusing on sewing garments, this video is going to focus more on buying them. Specifically buying vintage or vintage lookalike clothing and transitioning my wardrobe from something pretty cheap and average and uninspiring to something more inspired by the mid-1900s. I put a few feelers out to see if you guys would be interested in a video or a series about this process, and like 4 of you said you would be. And that was enough for me to decide to go for it, so thank you to those 4 people who left comments about this. I'm starting this series off with an introduction, which hopefully won't be too boring. I just wanted to talk a little bit about why I've decided to make this change in my wardrobe, as well as why I didn't decide to make this change earlier. And hopefully in future videos I can show you pieces I purchased, show you some outfits I put together, and also show the process of making pieces to add into my wardrobe, because there are certain items that I really want but I haven't been able to find already available in my size. So I think other videos in this series will probably be a little bit more interesting, a little bit more in line with things I posted on this channel before, but today I'm just introducing you to some of my thoughts on vintage fashion and some of the misconceptions that I had about it. I also wanted to say that this is really new to me. I think some people might be under the impression that I have been wearing vintage inspired clothing for a long period of time, since I do have videos dating back 2 or 3 years of me making 1950s themed dresses, and I've been styling myself in a similar manner for just as long. But I've never had any interest in wearing that type of clothing on a day-to-day basis, and I've never made any strides towards doing that, except for the past 2 or 3 months, because I had some major misconceptions about vintage fashion and vintage inspired fashion, which really prevented me from researching it further or considering it for me on a daily basis or at all. Some of my reasons for not researching this include: it is too expensive, it will not come in my size, vintage inspired clothing is tacky, and it's too high maintenance. I genuinely believe those things. I thought they were complete and total facts, and they prevented me from researching this further beyond the occasional Etsy search for 1950s dress, which quickly proved that at least half of these misconceptions were true. I think I also had a bit of a holier-than-thou attitude towards clothing. Not intentionally, it was just something that developed over time because clothing was never something that I considered important to me, and it was very important to people around me, so I was kind of proud that that wasn't something that I was interested in spending a lot of money on, and felt different and unique because that wasn't how I defined myself. But I think the real reason I wasn't interested in clothing was more because I didn't feel like I could be. Part of it was that up until recently my parents were buying the majority of my clothing for me, and I didn't want to make them spend more money than they had to. So if a $5 shirt had the same function as a $20 shirt, then I would probably go for that, even if I preferred the $20 one. I also didn't like most clothing in stores, and it was better to just shut myself off and not care about that than end up being unhappy with the selection. I may have also had a little bit of a fear that if I really liked what I was wearing and I didn't like how I looked, then I would kind of have to deal with the fact that I wasn't super pleased with my appearance. And especially when I was younger, in my teenage years, that was something that I really would have struggled to come to terms with. So I think it was just easier to throw on a pair of leggings and a baggy sweater and to acknowledge that I didn't look great, but to be able to blame that on the fact that I hadn't tried, if that makes sense. You might be wondering what changed, and the first thing that changed was the fact that I switched my bedroom and my sewing room. And in doing this, I ended up downsizing the amount of space I had for clothing by quite a lot, and that meant that I had to go through all of my clothing. And doing this made me realize that I had a lot of clothing. Like way more clothing than I thought I had. And despite the quantity, I realized there were very few pieces that I actually liked. I would say 99% of the clothing I owned, I either didn't wear, didn't feel flattered me, or didn't like the design of. Out of this massive mound of clothing that completely filled this closet, there were only 3 or 4 pieces that I really enjoyed wearing and felt any sort of attachment to. I definitely don't believe in the whole everything you own must bring you joy to keep it in your life sort of thing, but it was definitely a wake-up call seeing how much of my clothing I actively didn't like and didn't feel good in. I would say the main problems in my wardrobe were that I bought pieces that didn't fit me that well. And I also bought pieces that I didn't like that much just because they were cheap. I'm someone who definitely likes stuff, and sometimes that feeling of wanting new stuff kind of overrules the fact that I might not actually like that piece on its own that much. I also had a lot of pieces that did not fit me properly. I think I'm a very difficult person to fit. I might not look it, but I'm quite curvy. I have a 13-inch difference between my waist and my hips, so most pieces are too tight for me in the hips or fit me in the hips and are way too loose at the waist. I'm also 5'10", so most pants I owned didn't hit me properly in the waist either. They were way too low, and they ended up cinching in my stomach instead of my waist and just looked really unflattering. unflattering on me. To go along with this, shorts are usually too short for me and dresses are usually way too high-waisted. So I usually just ignored that fact and wore them anyway, or would end up wearing leggings and a sweater since that was something I knew I felt okay in, even if I didn't feel good in it. So that awareness of the problem and how much I dislike my wardrobe has been on my mind for a while, but it's been on the back of my mind. And it didn't really spring forth until I finished organizing my sewing room and gave my bedroom a bit of a makeover. That probably sounds weird, but in doing those things, I realized how much time and effort and money I had put into making my surroundings something that I found very visually pleasing and functional and just an environment that I really enjoyed being in. And I'm so happy in this space, and it just kind of made me think of how unhappy I am in the clothing that I owned. And that just made me really sad. And it's really not something that has ever actively bothered me like that before, but once I started feeling that way, I decided it was time to change something. It just so happens that around this time I got a Facebook ad for a website called The Collective, which is based in the UK but does ship worldwide. The ad for this was quite tacky and not super appealing looking, but they were having a 50% off sale, which completely drew me in. And in searching through their website for anything that I found appealing, I discovered the pants. If you're not familiar with the pants, I will put some photos of them on screen. These were pretty much everything I had ever wanted in pants. They were too long for the model, which meant they would probably be long enough for me. They had cute details around the waist cinched in with a belt. They were wide-legged, which meant they wouldn't hug my hips and look really unflattering. And I just fell absolutely in love with them, so I ordered 2 pairs. And once these arrived, I actually loved them enough that they made me start to question all of the misconceptions I had about vintage clothing and vintage-inspired clothing, which had been preventing me from integrating it into my wardrobe all this time. So that was a really long intro, but now onto the bulk of this video, which is going to be about those misconceptions I had, which I think some of you might have as well. So hopefully this will be interesting to anyone who wants to get into vintage fashion and might be using some of these reasons to prevent themselves from researching it further, because I know I was definitely guilty of that. So my first major misconception was that all vintage clothing was really expensive. It wasn't something that I thought was achievable for my budget because I thought each piece would cost between $100 and $500 to $100 each. And building a wardrobe out of that, though probably not ridiculous for some people, was definitely not something that I could ever even consider. And this impression of the cost was mostly based off of clothing I had seen sold at antique markets or antique stores that was wildly overpriced, or the top results on Etsy that came up when I searched for it. A lot of the dresses I was seeing on the front page when I searched for 1950s dress were designer gowns or evening gowns or just very expensive pieces in really good condition, which really skewed my perception of pricing of vintage clothing in general. And though there are definitely pieces out there that are way too expensive for me to ever consider purchasing, the more I researched it, the more I realized that there were actually a lot of affordable original vintage items out there, especially blouses, sweaters, cardigans, and accessories. The sweater I'm currently wearing only cost $15 and it came new with its tags from the 1950s. So if you're willing to search around, you can definitely find affordable pieces out there. They just aren't going to be the top result, and they probably aren't going to be in antique stores either unless you get very lucky. My next misconception was that all vintage clothing was really small. I thought it would be impossible to find a dress that had a larger waist measurement than 24 inches. And again, this was mostly based off of pieces I'd seen on the front page of Etsy, pieces I'd seen in the antique shops, as well as new old stock pieces that I'd seen sold on the Instagram accounts that I followed for inspiration. And I don't think I was too far off on this one. There are definitely far more pieces listed with a 24-inch waist than a 28-inch waist, but you can find the larger sizes out there. In fact, a lot of the pieces I was coming across were sizes too big to fit me that either had a 30-inch waist or a 32-inch waist or even a 36-inch waist. So if you are a size 12 or 14 or even a size 16, don't let the first impression stop you. If you dig far enough, you can probably find some original pieces in your size, and you might even find more than you expected. You're just gonna have to search a little bit harder for them. Misconception number 3 was that vintage clothing is difficult to maintain. You see, I grew up in a very practical, kind of lazy household where we did not purchase an article of clothing if it could not go in the washing machine. So I grew up with this misconception just in general that hand washing was some horrible, awful thing that you could never do no matter how much you liked a garment. Now, I have hand washed a couple of my own costumes and foundations, and it's not something that I find too horrifying to do, but isn't something that I enjoyed either, and I couldn't envision myself doing that on a regular basis for clothing that I wore every day. And this one was really hard for me to get over. Even when I started finding pieces in my size and in my price range, I still didn't want to pull the trigger and purchase them because I wasn't sure if I could keep up with the care requirements. But I told myself that if I really liked that article of clothing and I really liked how it made me feel when I was wearing it, then it was worth putting the extra effort into maintaining it. So I made my first order of vintage clothing and I went through the hand washing process with all of it. And you know what? It's not that bad. Actually, the first time I tried hand washing a batch of stuff, it was really quite awful because I made a couple mistakes. But I've done it several times since then, and it's not that bad. Especially if you wash garments as you wear them, so you only have one or two that need to be washed at a time, then you can do them really quickly in your sink and lay them flat or hang them overnight and they're ready to be worn again in the morning. It is really not that big of a deal and it does not take that long. It's not as convenient as throwing a bunch of pieces into a washing machine and having them be all fresh and dry in an hour or two's time, but it's not that difficult either, and I definitely think it's worth it for how good I feel in the pieces and how much I love looking at them. It's actually kind of nice being able to give them the care that they deserve, and it's a little bit soothing in that way. Kind of like cleaning my figurines, which is probably not a relatable way to describe that at all. And misconception 4 kind of goes along with this. I thought that vintage clothing was going to be really uncomfortable to wear, and I don't necessarily mean physically uncomfortable as in the fibers would feel bad against my skin. I more mean that I was concerned about how concerned I would be when I was wearing it. Let me find words that make more sense. What I mean is that I don't like putting a lot of thought into my clothing when I'm wearing it. I like picking out an outfit, I like feeling good with how the clothing looks on me, but I don't like being really worried about raising my arms and potentially popping a seam, or sitting down and potentially getting marks from the seat onto what I'm wearing, or washing my hands and being concerned about water splashing back on me. Like, I just didn't want to be wearing something and to be hyper aware of the fact that I was wearing it and worried about messing it up or damaging it in some way. And that's how I feel when I'm wearing my historical costumes. And I was kind of putting 1950s clothing in this special costumey category. And I really didn't want to feel that way on a daily basis. And I was really worried that that would become the new normal if this was something I transitioned into. And this also had to do a little bit with the washing concerns. Would I be concerned about sweating in a garment because that meant that I would have to wash something more often? As well as my concern about everything being too small for me. If the clothing was uncomfortably tight, that meant I might be limited in terms of mobility. And I was just really worried that I wouldn't feel comfortable in the clothing and the potential damage that could come to it while I was wearing it. Now at this point you might be thinking that the solution to all of these problems that I should have come to earlier is simply purchasing vintage inspired clothing or making it myself. But don't worry, I had a misconception about vintage inspired clothing too, and that was that I thought all modern vintage clothing was tacky. Yeah, please don't get too mad at me for saying that. I'm going to explain my thought process on this in a little bit more detail, as well as the fact that my thought process has kind of changed. My impression of modern vintage inspired clothing was just really bad. Most of what I had seen were featured ads on Facebook where they seemed to display the most colorful garbage pieces that they had, or they were ads I had gotten emailed to me where once again they were definitely advertising the brightest and the boldest. And that sort of represents my biggest problem with vintage inspired modern pieces. I feel like 95% of it imitates very specific trends that weren't actually that popular in the 1950s. I'm not saying they didn't exist, but if you look through a magazine from the 1950s, you're not going to see a lot of halter top polka dot dresses, or super cropped cardigans, or capped sleeves, or dresses made out of satin. Why are so many of the dresses made out of satin? And what is the obsession with anchors? If you like those styles, I think that is great. I'm really happy that there's something out there that you want to put money towards and wear and makes you feel good. I think that is fantastic regardless of what you are purchasing and putting on your body. So please don't let my opinion of those things influence your personal style or take it as something offensive to your personal style, because it's really not intended that way. It's just that those features, which are so common in the vintage inspired apparel out there, are not the things that attract me to vintage fashion. And those aren't the things that I would feel comfortable wearing on an everyday basis or making an entire wardrobe out of. So that really turned me off from the whole genre, I guess, for a long time, until I discovered the pants. And the pants made me search a little bit harder on these various vintage replica websites and made me realize that though 95% of what they're selling might not be my style and might not be things that I want on my body, 5% of it is pretty okay, if not really great. You just have to search a little bit harder for it. And trailing off of that, I also didn't have a lot of confidence in my ability to make my own vintage inspired pieces. And this was for 2 reasons. The first is that I don't have a lot of experience with making simpler dresses, and I'm not saying that as a humble brag. I actually think it's really, really impressive when people can make a very simple garment that looks incredibly sharp and tailored and professional, because it's challenging to do that. When the only detail work is how that piece is seamed and how precise the top stitching is, it can be really challenging, and I wasn't sure if I could accomplish that and end up with authentic looking pieces. And I think the fabrics available today make making authentic pieces relatively difficult too. Most of what is out there is too thick or too shiny or too stretchy to be a proper dress weight fabric for something inspired by the 1950s. So you have to search really hard to find materials that will give you that authentic finish, as well as work pretty hard on your own sewing skills to get that authentic finish. So I was really nervous about those 2 things. Over the past couple of months, especially with the Sewing Through Decades project, I've gained a lot of confidence when it comes to my skills when making more utilitarian style garments. And I think on that note, I'm going to end this video, but I will have a follow-up to this where I talk you through my first steps in venturing into vintage, some of the pieces I purchased, some of the pieces I regretted purchasing, and some of the pieces that I've made. So hopefully that'll be interesting. Hopefully this video was interesting. I'm really not sure how many people this will appeal to, but as I said, there were those 4 people who said I should do this, and that's why I'm doing this. And I'm also doing this because I want to do this, but mostly for those 4 people. I always get a little nervous branching out my content and making things that are, I guess, abnormal for this channel, but I do end up really enjoying the filming process, and I'm hopeful that you guys will enjoy these videos too. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below, and if you enjoyed this video, giving it a like really helps me out. As I said, this is going to be an ongoing series, so if you want to subscribe to see more videos like this, as well as my more normal sewing content, then you should definitely do that as well. And you can support my channel and my videos on Patreon if you feel so inclined. There will be a link to that in the description box, along with links to my various social media channels in case you want to see more of me, and I think that covers everything. So thank you so much for watching, I really appreciate it, and I will talk to all of you very soon.